Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Speak Easy podcast. The title of this episode is Narrating the Nation, Understanding How Southeast Asian Countries Understand Themselves. I'm Ikras Tawazun and I will be your host for today. And for today's guest, one that I would say a rising voice in Asian comparative studies, Assistant Professor Dean Dulay from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Welcome and thank you for making the time to be here, Professor.
Yeah, hi, Iklas.
Yes.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I really I'm excited to talk about my work with you.
Yes, and we are very excited to have you here with us today. In this episode, we will discuss the ever present memories of colonialism, nationalism, and its relevance to nation building. Because we generally understand colonialism as a bad thing. But is that really the case? We'll see more further in this episode. This interesting inquiry happens to be one of Professor Dean's latest research, titled Narrating the Nation Colonial Memory and Citizen Attitudes in East and Southeast Asia. To answer this, we will discuss several cases of nation building and their interaction with former colonies, particularly in Southeast Asia, critically examine the interplay between colonial memories, narratives of nationalism, and even positioning, especially of newly born countries in their context at the time within the global stage. So, to start off, Professor, I think you proposed a very interesting argument because the thing that you're trying to say, the way I'm getting it, is that you challenge that not all nationalism is anti-colonialist. Like we would say, generally, nationalism is a response to like former colonialism by former colonialists. Would you say it that way?
So I think it's interesting that we are having this conversation in Singapore because it was actually my observation of Singapore that sort of led me to these ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So, when we think as academics or social scientists, we think a lot about colonialism and its effects, the long run effects, and we still feel it, right? Like there's a huge influence of the colonial period on current levels of political and economic development. As as students of history and social scientists, this is what we know,
Mm-hmm.
and so underpinning a lot of these studies was this understanding that colonialism is bad. I mean, I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
It was
I
a
agree with
bad
that.
thing, right? Like they did a lot of colonial powers did things that are certainly disagreeable, and exploitative. But that's not the same as saying that there's a uniform recollection or memory of
Mm-hmm.
colonialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So different countries sort of think about the colonial past in different ways, or they remember it, so to speak, in different ways. And so when I moved to Singapore, one thing that struck me was like you would go and look at the museums and all that, and you'd see like Raffles this and
Yeah.
Raffles that.
Exactly.
You go to National Museum, and the way they talk about Raffles, it's very positive, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But Raffles was, he's a colonizer. Came to Singapore, and when you think about how you would think about a colonizer, you wouldn't, by conventional wisdom, think about them in this way. Like you're not gonna name a school after them, a mall after them, MRT station after them, right? So, and it's also prestigious. Like Raffles is like usually attached to some form of prestige. So, and you see a statue, like there's multiple Raffles statues around here.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at the plaque at the bottom, it's like it turned Singapore from a fishing village to a modern economy. That's the story. And that's the story that I think if you just ask what a conventional understanding of Singaporean history is, it does have a very somewhat positive interpretation of colonial history. And I was like, oh, that's very weird. It doesn't really it doesn't really make a lot of sense if you think about it in a standard way. Then I thought more about my own experience, as a Filipino growing up in the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
We definitely think Spanish colonization was bad. But, we were colonized by the Americans too for around
Mm-hmm.
over 40 years. And I grew up on a street called Taft Avenue. Taft.
Taft. Yeah.
Taft, after William Howard
William
Taft,
Howard
the
Taft.
first governor general of the Philippines. So there was this disconnect in my mind between how we think about colonialism in this very homogeneous way and how it should be remembered, right? Because we know about the revolutions in Southeast Asia against colonial powers, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then also you see these examples of like, you're kind of like thinking sort of positively about the past. And so it was that insight that led me to think, okay, this is something that's not, it's a story that needs to be told. There's a lot of variation and differences
Mm-hmm.
between what we think and what's actually happening. And so the paper was an attempt to put a structure, or put a conceptual or theoretical structure, around what we can observe to be differences in how different countries tell the story about the past. So that's the idea. And to me, like, it's actually really obvious that some
Yeah,
countries
yeah,
look at
yeah. I
colonialism
agree.
positively. So the memory is not the same per se as history. It's sort of my starting point, and then trying to put a conceptual structure around that was the aspiration of my research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in that sense, your research is a very groundbreaking one. And you imply that not all countries see their former colonialists negatively. And then how would you like categorize the way that countries now see their colonial past?
Yeah. So, we do a little bit more than say negative or positive, but
Mm-hmm.
that's certainly like one way to do it,
Mm-hmm.
right? What we have in this paper, so this is co-authored with Jiyoung Kook
Mm-hmm.
from Korea University, and we had this like typology, this three-term typology. It's continuity, creation, and restoration. So those are the three ways that people conceive of their nationhood and how they attach it to colonialism. So, positive, negative, you can say, well, there's this clear continuity narrative, and that's true for, let's say, the Philippines and the United States. So, then the continuity narrative, the Philippines has a very positive interpretation of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And like it was all about the United States giving us things, like gave us democracy, gave us development, right? And so those positive attributes are the foundation of this newly independent Philippine state. If you look at the structure of the Philippine government, it does mirror, even today, very much similar to how the American colonial government was structured. So we look at the US in this positive light as giving us certain things. And political leaders, especially independents, wanted to make that connection between the past and the present. It's not so different. In fact, they legitimize themselves by saying, hey, we are very similar to the US colonial government. For creation, the idea behind this creation narrative is to, in a way, detach the memory or the way of thinking about the independent nation
Mm-hmm.
from colonialism. So colonialism mattered, but we're trying to build a new nation that's totally different from the colonial period. And my example is actually Indonesia, Iklas,
Yes,
right?
where I'm
And
from.
so this idea, yes, for where you're from.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea there is like Dutch colonialism was very negative. I mean, we can read about it, it's very
It
obvious.
is.
But when we think about like how Indonesia is structured today, or how early nationalists, like Sukarno, thought about what Indonesia was, it didn't really integrate these ideas of colonialism. They tried to separate themselves from the colonial period in a very clear way.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a different way of thinking about colonialism. Colonial memory is, it's not central to national identity, if you put it like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's a fact, but it's not central to how you identify yourself
Mm-hmm.
today.
It's something in the past that
It's
doesn't
something in
matter
the past.
anymore.
It's something in the past. We know about it, a historical fact, but it doesn't really. It's not a central piece of how Indonesians construct their national identity.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So that's the difference, right? And the third is restoration. That's the third sort of like way of thinking about colonial memory. And our case study there was Korea and thinking about Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And the early Korean, South Korean nationalists positioned this new Korean nation as in continuity with the old Korea, right? We're restoring what was lost when Japan colonized us.
Mm.
Like we lost so much, right? But we're trying to bring that old nation back into the present and right the wrongs that were done to us. So you're not trying to forget in that way, right? Like there's a clear continuity between the past and the present. I was watching a Korean K drama like 2 days ago. Bon appetit, Your Majesty. I don't know if you've
Oh
seen it.
yeah,
I
I
don't
know
know
the
if you've
title,
seen
but
it.
I haven't seen it. I
You
haven't
haven't.
seen it.
It's
No.
okay. Maybe you should watch it. Like I was pretty entertained. But it's about the Joseon dynasty, right?
Oh
And
yeah.
so and so when I was watching that, I was like, It's the story of this cook who, like this Michelin star chef who travels into the past.
Oh, it's a classic historical
Yeah,
K
yeah.
drama.
But
Yeah.
like the idea, and there's many such stories, right? But when I was watching that, I was thinking, there's a clear continuity that these stories tell between the past and the present. They think about the past like that clearly was in some ways it was a clear precursor to modern day South Korea.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a clear line between the past and the present, right? And there are many reasons why we actually don't really know yet the factors that lead to countries taking on certain narratives or others. But ultimately, what I'm trying to say is like that actually shapes how people see the past and how they see their former colonizer. So in the Korean case, that's why we argue we see all of this negative public sentiment towards Japan, even today, right? There's a lot of issues that come up in Korea-Japan relations, and Korea tend to think of Japanese in a somewhat negative way in terms of public opinion. But the Philippines looks at the United States in an extremely positive light, and we argue that is because of this embedded memory of the past. So it's not just okay, we have different ways of looking at the past, positive, negative, and how we connect the past and the present. But I think that these memories actually shape how people in the present day look at the past and
Mm-hmm.
look at these former colonizers. So it shapes contemporary relations, contemporary feeling, shall we say.
Okay. Okay, and then what do you say that shaped the views of the present of the past? Is it like because of the founding fathers made it that way, or how does this came to be?
It's a difficult question. I'll say like that's one of the things that research has not exactly ironed out.
Mm-hmm.
So we're still trying to figure out why that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we can say now, at sort of a high level, right, that there's a variety of factors. The first factor is there is a particular incentive of founding fathers or independence leaders to frame a narrative in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in the Philippine context, in the initial leaders of the Philippines, they were set to take over the American colonial institutions. And
Mm,
so for them,
yeah.
obviously, it's in their self interest to say the US was great. Because these are the guys who are going to take over
Yeah, yeah.
the things that the US would hand it over to them.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not going to say to the country that hands over independence to them that their institutions suck and they did a terrible job, right? So there's an incentive rationale. I think there's also an ideological position that they take, and that can be related, but in some ways separate, right? If you believe that these institutions and this way of governing society is actually appropriate and it actually makes sense, then you're more likely to look at colonial institutions positively.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, with let's say the Philippine example, a lot of the pre independence leaders were groomed by Americans and they were cultivated through the American colonial system. This is a system they know and a system they understand. And so it's not just about their own incentive, I think. I think they're also ideologically predisposed
Mm-hmm. Okay.
to thinking about this in a positive light. On the other hand, I think that history also matters in the sense of you can't tell a story of restoration, let's say, if there's nothing to restore,
Okay.
right? So there's
Mm-hmm.
no past history. And in the Indonesian case, I think it's a very telling case in this regard. There were a lot of debates about how to think about the past and how to make connections between the past and the present. So the idea of Indonesia, there's a whole book about it. And so one thing that was very challenging for Indonesia's independence leaders was like actually making a connection between a sort of pre-colonial idea of Indonesia and a contemporary modern Indonesia. There simply was like, what would that look like? What was that
Mm-hmm.
even,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So there was really this. It's very difficult to tell that story because we can. There's no general agreement over what it would look like, right? And so you have it's like telling a story you need telling a story based on history you actually need historical facts like you can't just make it
yes,
up
you can
out of
just make it.
nowhere right you guys can't make it up in the Korean case they had a long history that they could use so part of the story I think is you countries actually need historical resources shall we say
Mm-hmm.
to be able to tell a certain kind of
Yeah.
story and they are in some ways limited and constrained by that so more broadly speaking, I think that there are personal incentive reasons, there are ideological reasons, and they're just historical and structural reasons why. So it's a combination of things. We're still trying to figure out exactly how these things work in combination, but that's what I can say about these factors.
Okay, so like these things that kind of historical resources that quantitative methods cannot really capture,
I think,
probably.
well, I think that
No?
I think that they are, it's hard to go into
Okay, okay. That's not
debates. No, but I'll go into it. No, 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 it's
okay.
okay. I think that historical case studies very clearly give you a macro picture and a
Mm-hmm.
macro comparative picture. So this paper is a comparative historical paper. I think the quantitative methods are valuable for adding more precision and going, let's say, going into more specific case studies.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that that depends on if the data is available, right? Maybe we can go into it on how, how the state shapes it and what it would look like to be able to tell this story quantitatively. But I think there's a role for both qualitative and quantitative methods in this field. It's super new. So we're still developing these methods, how to apply them. But I think there's a role for both.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, then going deeper into your argument, I think one of the things that you measure is public opinion,
Yeah.
right? So maybe relating to the narrative, and it has been like a few decades, a lot of
Mm.
decades since their independence. And is the narrative stable or is it probably contentious? I mean, Philippines, maybe some people challenge that American colonialism was actually bad or.
I think when we think about narratives,
Mm-hmm.
every country has people who disagree, right, with the conventional state narrative.
Yes.
So, in every context, you're going to get a multiplicity of narratives. So, but what we focused on, in our paper was the state's narrative.
Mm.
Because we take the implicit view that the state narrative is very important because the state is particularly good at spreading its narrative. It has the resources to do so. It has
Yes.
the schools, it can have textbooks, statues, museums. It has all of these resources to tell that story. In reality, there are groups that maybe challenge the narrative. But the reach of these groups, in general, is not as broad as the state is, right? So we start from the position that the state narrative tends to be the dominant narrative and the most prevalent narrative. And other narratives seek to challenge it. What we don't have a clear view yet is the role of contestation. So do narratives change?
Okay.
I think we all agree that the state narrative is dominant. It is hard to change. Most people tend to subscribe to some version of it, but it can change over time.
Mm-hmm.
But that process of change is something that is not really something that happens really easily. And I think that this is the next frontier. Like, when do these narratives actually change in a fundamental way? But I will say that in many cases, and you look at the cases that we see in our paper, what we did is we look at textbooks over the decades, and we see that the fundamental narratives don't change very much. So I think that while they can change, they tend to be they tend to be very stable.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Okay, they're stable, but probably subject to another study.
Yes.
Okay, and then I think in some countries, probably a lot of them, the picture is sometimes more complex. You know, like in Singapore, Malaysia, and also Indonesia, where we actually have like multiple colonial masters. We have the Japanese, we have the British,
Yeah.
Indonesia have the Dutch, a bit of Portuguese as well, actually. But then not all of them are shed in the same light. Just as you mentioned, Singapore view the British colonial times quite favorably, but not quite the same with the Japanese. I mean, how can you explain that picking and choosing of former colonialists?
I think it's another thing that's really hard to
Yeah.
answer. I will say that, does the colonial power, the identity of the colonizing power, matter? So is it British? Is it Spanish? Is it Dutch? I think it matters to some extent, but it depends on the actual policies that are implemented by that colonial power on the ground. So in general, there's this paper that talks about countries that were colonized by the British tend to have better long-term economic development
Mm-hmm.
than those colonized by the Spanish, shall we
Mm-hmm.
say. That was the explicit comparison of this paper, a very famous one. So there might be some role in the colonial power because of the kinds of institutions that they put in place. However, it's not going to be uniform, and it depends it depends a lot on the context. So for example, the British, okay, in Singapore, people look at the British in a positive light, but that's probably not the case in Burma, in Myanmar.
Yeah.
So there's going to be an exception to that. And I think the trying to figure out the answer in terms of colonial power and whether they are viewed positively or negatively, that comes from understanding the process of creating that colonial memory in these countries, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first part that I want to say. The second is it's true that in reality, colonial history is complicated. So whether you want to call it colonial or imperial, most of Southeast Asia had Japanese occupation
Yeah.
in the 1940s. But we don't really, as I say, the Philippines. I mean, Philippines loves Japan. A lot of countries love Japan. We don't really think that, you know, 80 years ago, 90 years ago, they were just rampaging through Asia and had a very brutal occupation during the war. And so, why do we forget? I guess that's another way of putting it.
Oh, yeah.
In my view, there is a. I actually think that forgetting about the past and returning to a sort of status quo is the default. Most
Mm-hmm.
countries, most citizens of most countries are relatively indifferent to the former colonial power. And the states themselves don't put them on a pedestal as particularly horrible all the time.
Uh-huh.
You know, they say it as historical fact. But in my view, when these colonial memories really tend to matter a lot is when they have political salience and importance to independence leaders.
Mm-hmm.
They are used in that very particular way to legitimize them. And that sort of, there's a sort of path dependence. Once leaders talk about a certain country in this very particular way, it tends to be carried over and continued over time. And but with the Japanese occupation, I don't think that there was a huge, for example, for the Philippine leaders, there was no huge incentive for them to really remember Japan in this way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, because there's no incentive for remembering, there's forgetting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, okay. But of course, it means that founding fathers, the independence leaders, have like huge agency in kind of deciding which trajectory it will be.
I think so.
Okay, yeah.
I think that founding leaders have significant agency
Mm-hmm.
in developing a narrative. And once it's developed very early, and once people, they inculcate it into the narrative when they're very young,
Mm-hmm.
it's really hard to dislodge, right? Like you can imagine when you're growing up and you learn about, hey, this is what Indonesia is. This is Indonesian history. It's the same way with me. This is, the Philippines. This is Philippine history. And you grow up into an adult, and I think to myself, why do I think all these things? It's because when I was young and uncritical, that's just what I've been learning my whole life. So you can imagine there's certain things that you learn as a child, you grow up and you believe them, and they just kind of become embedded in you. You think of them as just the reality and the truth,
Mm-hmm.
and and that just carried over, over generations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Would you agree if I say like the British generally, of course there are exceptions, but
Mhm.
they're generally viewed more positively, like probably by their former colonial countries. Yeah.
It's
Generally
subject
speaking.
it's subject to systematic empirical
Yeah. Okay.
verification. You know,
Hot takes.
if
This is
I
just
if
your
I
hot
ever-
takes.
if I were to put it like that, it's subject to systematic empirical verification.
An
So
academic.
so I think the way I'd see it is like the the British systematically it's really hard to say. I think this is not about normatively, right? Whether the
Mhm.
British were better. Or whether colonialism was good. That's not what we're
No,
saying
no, of
here,
course it's
right?
not.
That's
No.
not what we're saying here. But there are a few countries that look at British colonialism positively, and I mean, there's countries that look at them negatively for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
But there are a few that look at them in this more positive light, and it's and maybe only for that fact, the colonial memory of the British is on the margin more positive. Because it's very hard for me to think of of countries that look at the Spanish colonialism very
Yeah,
positively.
yeah.
So
Same with the Dutch. I
so
mean,
it's like so it's almost like a zero and like some,
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
it's more like that. But that's not the same as saying that like the institutions of the British were better or worse. I mean, other people can make that argument, but that's not really what we're trying to say. Like we try to detach it from the actual institutional history in a way and say, well, memory is this complex thing and it's not the same as what happened historically. So I'll give you an example just to clarify this. The Philippine American War was super duper violent. We don't know how many people were killed. The estimates like vary greatly. But let's say on the low side, it's maybe 500,000 people. That's
Mm.
incredibly violent. And I think that's almost certainly more than everyone who was killed by orders of magnitude in the Philippines under the Spanish colonialism. But the memory is very different. Spanish negative, American colonialism or US colonialism positive. So, but why is that? When you just think about how violent it was. And I think that that's something that we need to remember. Like the actual institutions put in place is not going to be the same as the memory we have of them in the future.
Okay. Okay. And then you mentioned about like dyadic relationships between the former colonialists and the post-colonial
Yeah.
states. I mean, how does it matter? I mean, I know like the British have some sort of commonwealth that continues to engage with former post-colonial countries until today. How do you see it?
How do I see what?
How the dyadic relationship? How does it matter? Does it matter significantly? For example, like to keeping how some countries view their former colonialists positively. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a continued engagement
Yeah.
because in some countries, when the colonialists left, like how Japan left Korea, it was like not good at all, and it was not there was not a continued engagement, if I can
Yeah.
say.
Yeah. So I think I guess your question assumes something like how does it matter in a sort of policy or practical
Yeah,
perspective,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So to be honest with you, I didn't write this paper for a policy or practical reason. I wrote this
Okay.
paper simply to understand the past and how we think about it. But there are reasons, I think, that still matter today. So we actually start the paper by talking about Korea-Japan relations. And we say, these countries have a lot of incentive for greater cooperation. But the reason why they're not cooperating more than you would expect them to, given the economic and security incentives for them to cooperate, it's because of this memory of Japan in the colonial past. Because the Korean public itself is not comfortable with its very intimate ties with Japan because of how they think about the past. So it affects their current relations. And I think that's true not just for the Korean case, in the Philippine case, we think and I put this in the paper. We had the president Duterte from 2016 to 2022, and he was saying a lot of anti-American stuff,
Oh yeah,
anti-US
yeah, yeah.
stuff,
I think
right?
that was an exception though. Yeah.
Duterte
Duterte.
was an
Yeah.
exception, and he was very anti-US.
Uh-huh.
But if you look at public opinion towards the US,
Uh,
it didn't actually fall by that much. It was
mhm.
still on that positive. So that was the one thing. Like Duterte is so effective generally at shifting public opinion, but he couldn't really do that for the US. Positive public opinion fell to like I don't really know the number now, like 60 to 70%. I mean, that's still pretty high
Yeah, it's
when
it's
you think
high.
about it,
Yeah.
right? It's still pretty high. And that kind of shows you that this is very strong and very persistent. And I don't think it comes from the vagaries of foreign policy, in the current day. I think it comes from a deeply embedded understanding of the US and perception of the US. And that is something that's a byproduct of the colonial memory from American colonialism. But
Mm-hmm.
we think those things are important, right? In certain dyads, they still matter.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Uh, it's very interesting. Do you have anything to say as a closing statement for this?
I think that this idea of memory is something that, let's say, mainstream or quantitative social scientists have not really engaged with seriously until recently. But in my view, the way that people look at the past, or even the role of their state in the world today, like their worldview, shall we say, is extremely important to understanding their actions in the world, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you look at the world now, without giving like particular examples, you just look at the world now. Can can major global events be purely a function of economic and security incentives. Of course, they matter, right? Of
Yeah.
course, but we know this already. But it's not everything. Like perceptions of what of status, where a country should be, what their relationship should be in the global order. I think those things matter, and I feel like, and they don't just matter for the major countries. They matter for many countries and how they see themselves. And this is a new area. We don't know so much about it from a scientific perspective. And I think that people who are interested in doing so and thinking about it and studying it, I think they should be encouraged to do so because I think that there's a lot we could learn. And not just about the practical things about policy and institutions, but also about ourselves and why we think the way that we think. Ultimately, that's what drove the research. It was not a policy,
Yeah,
like related thing. It was simply to
yeah.
understand.
It's a contemplation.
It's a contemplation, a reflection to try to understand the world better. And so I think it's important, and I hope that people would think about it more and do more work on it.
Great. Such an insightful and very important closing statement. I think we do need to think about it more because we used to think about colonialism in a very simplistic way that everything's negative, but no. The way that we think is actually shaped on how our founding fathers, our state, decided like to adopt a certain kind of narratives, and then it shaped how our country came to be, how ourselves came to be, and I do think that it is indeed a very interesting field of study that still somewhat understudied, and you are very starting this research. And I hope I can read more from researchers and especially from you to better understand our nations and ourselves. So, thank you again for being here, Professor Dean, and thank you again for everyone who have tuned in to this episode. I hope it was as stimulating for you as much as it is for me. Hope to see you soon on the next Spec Easy podcast. Bye bye.